If you would just start with the presidential party arriving at Love Field and take me through the motorcade.
Okay. To jump back a couple of minutes, the vice president's plane was in, and so that's the small staff of his plus his agents and the vice president and so forth. They greeted the local host committee and some other people, and then went over to be in the area where we were going to spot the president's plane. The press plane had come in prior to that, because the press plane, at least in those days, and I would imagine still, the press plane tries to leave after the president leaves someplace so that they're able to see. It's like a death watch, frankly. They're waiting to see if something happens getting on the plane or before he gets on the plane, if the plane crashes or whatever. So then the president's plane takes off, the press plane gets up in the air, and if it's a far enough trip, then they somehow try to get ahead of the president, and then they land first so that they're in their press pen and so forth and doing their thing when the president arrives. Again, like the death watch or something, see whatever might happen. So you've got the press, and you got the local host committee, and you got the vice president's group visiting the president. And the president comes, and Mrs. Kennedy and some staff and agents and whatever come down, and goes over to the chain link fence that was there. I have pictures of it that there are all kinds of people on the other side of the fence, and there are all kinds of people on the airplane side of the fence. You can't even see the fence. There are almost as many people on the airplane side of the fence because of the hangers-on and the staff and the press and the this and that, you know. So, and President Kennedy and Ms. Kennedy go along the fence greeting people and being seen and seeing people, and for a few minutes, and then they go over and get in their car, and the motorcade takes off. A special cut was made in the fence to allow the motorcade to go out to a certain place, you know, to start the motorcade and all that. And the pilot car is now gone ahead, and the lead car that I was in was just ahead of the president's vehicle, a follow-up car behind him, and then some other vehicles, and the vice president and the staff, and it was quite a motorcade. Buses and staff cars and VIP cars and things of that type.
Who was in the lead car with you?
The lead car was driven by Chief Curry in his, either his or another unmarked Dallas police car, driving, so he was in the left front seat. I was in the right front seat. Sheriff Decker was in the rear seat, and SAIC Sorrells, the agent in charge, Sorrells from the Dallas field office, was in the back seat. Unprecedented.
About how far ahead of the limousine did the lead car stay throughout most of the motorcade?
You usually try to be pretty darn close, you know, so that they can see where you're going and all that, because if you have to go to a hospital, or you got to do this or that or whatever, in those days, especially when the driver didn't come. Now probably one of the drivers would have been part of the advance team. I remember, I think I said before that you'd have site agents, depending on how many sites. You'd have a motorcade agent, you'd have the technical people, the intelligence people, an airport agent, the site at the trademark agent, and so forth. But the lead car, the presidential car, follows that lead car, and he stays up pretty darn close to the lead car to keep anybody from coming in between the two cars, just like the follow-up car is almost on their bumper, to prevent people, things, cars, etc., from coming out of a side street and being able to get in between. As a matter of fact, that's the only reason why Clint Hill was able to get on that car, was because it was so close. to the president's car and all that.
In some of the films that we have here at the museum that show the motorcade going along, you see the buildings downtown, and there's open windows and people looking out of the windows. Was that something that concerned you as you were going along?
It concerned you, but in those days there was nothing you could do about it. If there's a parade situation today, each field office has already made a survey of known motorcade routes, whether it's in Dallas or New York or wherever, you know, to probably the areas that people would be going to in a motorcade type situation. Agents have inspected the building with the maintenance people, the building manager, owner, whatever. And today's modern buildings, most of them, you can't open up a window. You know, these new high-rise office buildings and all that, the windows don't open. You can't even throw a chair through one if you wanted to. There are some of the older buildings and so forth that you still can open windows. But what they do, they put out a notice. I mean, this is not a country where by fiat you can just say you can't open your windows. I mean, it's not a totalitarian country, but you can request people not to open their windows. You can request people not to bring all their friends down and be in your window because, boy, this would be a great vantage point to see this motorcade. You know, please don't do that. If you want to see, go on down and whatever. Or if you are in your windows, they got to be closed or whatever. And they have enough people now with stationed along with radios and counter sniper teams on certain buildings that look down on other buildings and all that belong to the Secret Service counter sniper teams. And if they see an open window or if they see something that looks suspicious, and also it's requested that people not be on rooftops and all that. And there are certain things that they do so that you know if there's someone on that rooftop, that's a security person or whatever, you know. So if they see anything that type, immediately it's broadcast, such and such a building, the 6th floor, right-hand side, there's an open window. That gets broadcast to those agents or the police in that area so that they can immediately check it out or at least keep it under surveillance if they can't get there in time. And at the same time, it goes to the motorcade.
We have a home movie that shows the motorcade making a turn. I believe it's from Lemon Avenue onto Main Street, and an agent or two agents from the follow-up car come and ride on the side of the presidential limousine. Why would they do that when making a turn?
They may have seen something in the crowd, or maybe people started out, you know, it's not uncommon. As a matter of fact, it's common for people to try to get out, touch the car, touch the president or whatever, and that's why that's a bone of contention sometimes between the president and the staff and the Secret Service. We'd love to have motorcycles completely surrounding his car, but noise, lack of sight back and forth, etc. They just don't want it. We'd like to have them in a bubble all the time if we could, and not just a plastic one, but another one. But you have to give and take in these type of things. And I would imagine something happened on that route where either people were coming out or something else caused them to jump off and run up. Often, I mean, that's just done all the time.
At one point during the Dallas motorcade, there was a group of people, and they had a sign that said, you know, please stop and shake our hands. And I believe the motorcade did slow long enough for some folks to shake the president's hand. Do you recall that?
I don't, but that happens a lot. You can plan, depending on the president that it is, the type of things that you know he likes or doesn't like, or she. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not a chauvinist, but so far we haven't had a lady president, so I'll probably keep saying she and all that. But rather than probably keep saying he. But President Kennedy, you could almost always figure that he went by a Catholic church or a Catholic school and there was some nonsense and kids out there, he's going to stop. I don't know how many times. You just would know that. And if that was on your particular route, you'd try to put some police there ahead of time and all that, you know. And if, like the sign you said, sometimes there's some signs that you don't know what they're going to be. But as you're going along and all of a sudden you see this sign, you say, oh, that's a catchy sign, or that's something that I'll bet you that those people about 10 yards behind us or less are probably going to stop. And it happens a lot. Frankly, I'd rather see the president go along and going along, all of a sudden the president would see something be interesting, stop the car, I want to go over here, because that's an unplanned thing. Now, where it's dangerous is that if somebody has a catchy thing or some reason, somehow it's going to tickle their fancy, and then plan it so that he's probably going to stop here, so I'm going to be the assassin here and so forth. But it's the true unplanned things. You don't have to worry as much on those unplanned things. Sometimes people, oh, didn't that drive you nuts when you stopped at such a place? No, frankly, I'd rather have him stop there when no one knew that he was going to do it than someplace that you would know about.
There had been some anti-Kennedy literature in Dallas, the Wanted for Treason poster and the black bordered ad in the Dallas Morning News. You saw this prior to the motorcade?
I did.
What did you think about it?
Well, it's a free country. They can say what they want. You'd be concerned about it, but you've made your plans and you've done the best thing you can and just hope that everything will work.
Did you report it to anybody, or was that not?
Well, the police brought it. I can't remember now. Someone brought to my attention. Mr. Sorrells had already seen the flyer, for example. The police brought it to my attention. They knew it before I did.
Do you have any idea whether President Kennedy saw any of that literature?
I do not know.
During the motorcade, were you focused on the car, or were you looking at the crowds?
I probably should have had a head on a swivel, because I would be looking forward. For example, I remember looking forward here, at the overpass, and seeing people up there who had been arrangement that there'd be a policeman, at least up there, and if anybody, they couldn't be directly over us and so forth. Well, there were some people standing on that, and I was trying to kind of making a motion like this, to the policeman, get these people away from us and so forth. I also would keep looking behind to make sure that, to tell Chief Curry to speed up, to slow up, to whatever, depending on the situation. I'd be looking at the crowds also, just in case I could see something and broadcast to the follow-up car, or particularly the president's car, saying, watch out for such and such on the right or left. So my head would have been on a swivel the whole time, looking ahead, looking forward, looking sideways, looking backward.
As you entered Dealey Plaza, did you make any comments to Chief Curry?
I don't remember that I did.
I seem to remember reading in your testimony that you made the comment that you were only about 5 minutes away.
Oh, yes. I think I probably asked him, aren't we about 4 or 5 minutes from the Trade Center? And I think he said yes. And I said, okay, so I can't remember now whether I broadcast to the people out at the Trade Mart. I think he did to his the various officers that were on duty out at the Trade Mart.
Well, if you can, tell me in as much detail as you remember about the assassination itself.
I believe I was just about to go under the pretty close anyway to the underpass to go on the Stemmons Freeway sometime a little bit later, and I heard a shot like that, and then I heard another one, and then the third one was a little closer to the second one than the second one was to the first one. And I didn't think firecrackers, I didn't think pop balloons. I thought shots. And I thought immediately that it, you know, because I was facing that way, I thought immediately that it had come from over my right-hand shoulder, which, in fact, it had. And it was so quick and all that, and I think almost immediately we heard from the president's car, the assistant agent in charge, Kellerman, said something about floor it or hurry or the president might be hit. Around that same time, a motorcyclist pulled up alongside of us, I believe, and said to Chief Curry that the president had been hit. And both of us said to one another, you know, we got to get to Parkland Hospital, and he started broadcasting whatever he had to do, and I started calling on my radio to people and so forth, and he floored it, and we went out Stemmons Freeway going like heck, and as a matter of fact lost most of the motorcade, you know, that wasn't part of the security bubble. And as a matter of fact, they, not even knowing what had happened, or maybe wondering what had happened, part of the motorcade pulled into the Trade Mart, not knowing that we'd gone right on by the Trade Mart and gone to Parkland Hospital. But we went about as fast as you can go out through there, and I don't know how Clint Hill ever stayed on that car.
During the assassination itself, did you see the president or Mrs. Kennedy?
No, you mean back?
Behind you?
No.
You didn't see anything? So you weren't actually aware who was hit or if anyone was hit?
No, I just heard the shots and then was told that the president had been hit and so forth. Yeah.
And you think the shots came from?
I know they came from my back right. I mean,
back right.
I'd fired enough before and I'd fired enough since, and on firing ranges and all that. I knew rifle fire, and I knew where the shots came from.
Well, as you got to Parkland Hospital, why don't you pick up the story there and tell me what happened?
Chief Curry had already had someone notify the hospital that we were on our way, and when we arrived, I ran in the emergency area and met someone coming with a couple of gurneys and all that, and turned around and helped them get back out, these gurneys out to the car. Of course, Governor Conley and his wife had been in the jump seats, which are fold up seats, and they were in front of the president and Mrs. Kennedy. And Governor Conley had to be moved before the president could be moved. And then I helped put President Kennedy and with other agents and people and all that on one of the gurneys and go into the emergency room area and to the trauma place there where we were guided to. And originally went on in with the president and the doctor and the people pushing the gurney and all that. And then not too much later, I don't even know how much longer, but I went back outside to make sure that, because my advance wasn't done, make sure that we had people from the hospital, just letting the proper people in the area, that there were agents in the area. I soon found out that they were already taking care of President Johnson in another area close by. The agents had him and so forth. And then went to one of the offices nearby where there's a telephone and called Washington and kept the line open with Washington with our Secret Service headquarters all the time we were there.
Did you get a good look at the president's wounds when you approached the motorcade?
No, I don't know if Clint Hill had already put his coat over his head at that time or not. I don't recall whether, but I know that when we were in the trauma room and when they were starting to take care of him before I left the room, that he was not moving. He was extremely gray. I mean, I can't describe the color that he was.
Did you feel at that time that it was a fatal wound?
Yeah, I think I did in my mind.
The back of the limousine, it was pretty bloody. Did you notice that when you went up to it?
No.
You didn't? Did you encounter Mrs. Kennedy or have any communication with her during this?
I didn't have any communication with her, but she went on in, with us to the trauma room, and she was in there for a while, and then I think her staff took her out and so forth.
What were you feeling at this moment?
Shock. You wonder, everything is going through your mind, what could I have done that I didn't do? How did I mess up, and if so, how? I was the first agent to lose a president, and to this day, I'm still the first agent to lose a president. I can't say that I couldn't believe it, because that it can happen all the time, but I was in shock that it did happen. I don't mean in shock like people with a wound or something that go into shock, but I was just my gosh, it did happen type of thing.
There have been stories that in the immediate aftermath there in Parkland there was some confrontations, an actual physical struggle between some FBI agents and some Secret Service agents. Do you recall that?
No, I don't know. See, I wouldn't have been, right off the bat I was inside, and I was in the trauma room, and then from there to the office, and I stayed there at that telephone and all that, and I didn't leave until we took the body out to put it in the undertaker's hearse or whatever it was. I think it was a hearse, and then riding on out to the airport to help put the body on the airplane. Some of the agents had already left by that time, because they'd taken then Vice President Humphrey. Listen to me, Vice President Johnson. I'm sorry. I was with Vice President Humphrey, so once in a while I'll get them mixed up. But some of the agents had already gone out with Vice President Johnson, and then, of course, he was not sworn in because he waited for Mrs. Kennedy to get out there before he was sworn in, and that was after we got out to the place.
A point of controversy that has come up over the years is the fact that while the motorcade was there in the Parkland Bay there, some Secret Service agents got some buckets and sponges and started wiping out the back of the limousine. I know you weren't part of the group that did that, but do you have any idea why they would have done that immediately at that point?
No, I don't.
Okay. It's just something I wanted to ask, because it's stuff that comes up.
Yeah, right.
Okay, and one other thing I wanted to ask you about the motorcade. Another myth is that the lead car actually stopped after you emerged from the triple underpass. The lead car
never stopped.
Never stopped. Okay. Okay. Well, once you got back out to Love Field with the casket, why don't you go ahead and pick up the story there, if you would?
Well, I waited outside the airplane. Chief Curry, had gone out with Vice President Johnson. So Chief Curry was inside, and he was in there when the federal judge came and swore in Vice President Johnson to become president. And then pretty soon the plane started to taxi and left, and I rode with Chief Curry in his car down to police headquarters. And agent in charge Sorrells was I don't know if he was at his office, but eventually he came over to police headquarters also, and I was there in police headquarters for a number of hours, and I saw the complete chaos that was there. You wouldn't believe how many people were in there. You know, people in off the street, the police themselves, the news people. You could hardly walk up and down the corridors for the amount of people that were in there. At one point, I looked in on, his name is Fritz. I can't remember if he was a captain or what, but he was head
Captain Will Fritz.
He was homicide. I think he was chief of homicide detectives, and listened in on some of his and Mr. Sorrell's, one of them, questioning Oswald, and back around. Then sometime later, I went over to FBI office, and then eventually was taken to one of the Air Force bases near here, and rode back to Washington, D.C. to Andrews Air Force Base with some of the evidence that they had collected, and a couple of the FBI agents that were on the plane. And we landed back there about 6 in the morning, 6 or 6:30 in the morning at Andrews Air Force Base Eastern time.
While you were at the police station, did you ever see Lee Harvey Oswald?
Yeah.
Did you sit in on some of the questioning?
No, I
or
didn't
anything
sit
like
in
that?
on any of it. I watched some of it, and I saw a couple of times when I think they moved him from one place to another place, but never talked to him, never.
Considering your position, did you have any personal feelings when you saw this man?
I suppose. Yeah, I really can't even think right now about it because I still. No, I can't recall any particular feelings that I had about him.
Is there anything else relating to the FBI that occurred here in Dallas that's worth putting on the record?
Not that I had anything to do with.
Do you recall what the initial thought was? I mean, there's been talk that originally they might have thought it was some sort of conspiracy, that it was a Russian plot or something like that. Were you privy to any of those discussions by the FBI?
No.
Okay.
No. I just know that they wondered if it was part of a plot to get the president and the vice president. That's why they wanted him out and back in Washington as soon as possible. And I wasn't a part of any discussion really about that.
Okay. Well, once you got back in Washington, what part did you play in the funeral, and what other?
I gave a written statement on the 23rd to my knowledge of everything that I knew that I had done and people had done on the 22nd. And then on the 1st of December, I wrote 2 memoranda. One, everything that I could remember about the advance from the first hearing about it on the 4th of November through the 21st of November, and then a separate one, which was more detailed than the one that I'd done on the 23rd, for events that I could recall on the 22nd. And but that wasn't until December 1st. But you asked me about the funeral, so I was on duty at the funeral. I was on duty at the gravesite, and that was really something, the funeral and being a part of it, and the music and everything that was going on. I remember just being extremely sad, being extremely sorry. And the Secret Service kept me pretty busy. Like I said, the day after it, I was in, and I went to work each day. Primarily the first few days, it was all talking to people about the advance and this and that, and writing things for the record and all that. Eventually, I gave testimony to the Warren Report, and then later, what was it, 78 or whenever it was, that the House committee, special committee. I testified at that also. But I stayed on. I don't know that there was any formal request, but I think I may have indicated in some way that I wanted to stay on protection for a while. Ordinarily, I probably would have been transferred. As I said, I came from Syracuse to in those days, the White House Detail, which is now Presidential Protective Division. I got there in '61, spring of '61. This was fall of '63. I probably, without anything happening in Dallas, I probably would have been there another year, maybe a year and a half, and then transferred to some field office, then back maybe to Washington in some capacity, and then back to another field office, because it's not uncommon for agents to be transferred 6, 7, or 8 times in their career. In my mind, I felt that I owed it to protection, to stay in protection for a while if they would let me. And you know, the Secret Service didn't fire me. I don't think there was a reason to, but I mean, they could have found reasons to. They didn't fire me. They didn't transfer me to one of the places that people hear about, you know, if there's an agent that they want to discipline or something, whether it's the FBI, the Secret Service, or Internal Revenue. There are always 1 or 2 offices where they're going to ship Joe Blow off to one of the offices, kind of for penance or whatever it is. They never sent me to someplace in Montana to an office or something like that. I continued on working. I was on President Johnson's detail then from that point on until I went to Vice President Humphrey's detail in 1966, and I stayed there until about 1968 when I went with Vice President-elect Agnew, and then I had then I was sent over to our Office of Protection in headquarters, where I had I got promoted in the Humphrey detail. Then I got promoted on the Agnew detail to assistant agent in charge of the detail. Then I was made a special agent in charge, a brand new position in the Office of Protection, where I was the one that filtered out the requests for post standards, and you know, an advance agent and some place would call in and say, now that they had more agents, I need 30 agents in Austin for Vice President so-and-so or President so-and-so. And I'd wake up in the middle of the night, was that Austin or Boston? But I got those requests, and then I also had something to do with people being transferred in and out of protective divisions. And then also had quite a bit to do with transferring people temporarily. If the Queen of England was coming, or the Prime Minister of England or Great Britain, or the Emperor of Japan or something like that was coming, I had to go and borrow agents from the Office of Investigations. The Office of Investigation, I was in Office of Protection, we had all the details, whether they were temporary details or regular details, like the President, the Vice President, the candidate details, the whatever. And if we found out that King Hussein of Jordan was coming to town, hopefully it wasn't late on a Friday afternoon and he was coming on Sunday, but often it happened. And I had to go over to the Office of Investigations, because they're the ones that had the manpower out in the countryside. And you'd say to the Deputy Assistant Director over there, look, King Hussein is coming in. He's going to arrive in New York City day after tomorrow, and we got to put a detail together. And it might be for 3 days, it might be for 3 weeks. And I was then involved quite a bit in the 25th anniversary of the UN, which happened up in New York City. And we were, by that time, we had heads of state, heads of government, and we were charged with protecting people that came to the UN that fall. And at UN 25, of course, there were, you know, more than the normal amount of premiers and prime ministers and kings and that type of thing. And was up in New York City from August through November, to part of November on that deal. Eventually became, the Secret Service sent me to Cornell Graduate School right after that particular thing, because I was starting to get a little burned out on that one. 7 in the morning to about 11 o'clock every night for about 4 months. And then was made the agent in charge of our liaison division, which we hadn't had in 1963. But that was one of the things the Warren Report brought out. We should have better liaison with the other federal agencies and so forth. So I was about the 3rd agent in charge of that, but eventually we had liaison agents spending a lot of time with the FBI, with the CIA, with the NSA, the National Security Agency, which you may or may not have heard of. And they're the ones that hear the talk out of the ether waves and so forth, and all that around, and everything from customs and State Department and so forth. And then went from there to Deputy Assistant Director for Inspection. That would be like internal affairs in a police department, or the IG or some, Inspector General, something like that. Deputy Assistant Director for that, and with that you would have the internal investigation if any one of the agents, you know, was either suspected or was pointed out as maybe having done something wrong or something like that. That was the B part, and the A part was just inspecting the offices. And you'd have inspectors who are people that have been an agent in charge of about a medium field office to a large field office. And then there are assistant inspectors, and they would do investigations if need be, and they'd also inspect the offices to make sure they were they'd liaison with the local officials to see that everything was all right between the Secret Service and the local people, whether it's the mayor, the police, the whatever. Check the records and make sure they're doing their investigations properly. Check with the people they'd have to work with on any protectees that were coming through and all that. So then became the acting assistant director of Secret Service for inspection, and then I left. I retired instead of becoming the assistant director for inspection. And,
what year did you retire?
I retired in 1981.
What did you talk about with the other agents? Some of the other agents that were involved on the Dallas detail. What did you talk about in the aftermath?
In a way, a lot of the agents didn't talk to me about it, except in one regard. And to my dying day, I will be very grateful for this. They would come up to me and say, if it had to happen to any agent win, we're glad it was you. And I mean, you know, originally, you know, but they meant that in a good way. I took pride in the fact that they knew that I had already done a good advance, that I had done at least as much, and probably in certain phases of this Dallas advance, more than most people had done. They knew I didn't drink, and there was always that, you know, there was that problem that had come up. They knew I didn't fool around, and so I took that as a compliment, and they meant it as a compliment. We didn't talk very much, other than we didn't talk too much about the advance or what had happened. I think part of it was they didn't want to bring up certain things, but really about the most. And to this day, I still get some of that. That if it had to happen, we're glad it was you. One thing though, here's an anecdote for you. After I was at headquarters, I would, get to work about 7:38 in the morning, and I'd go back. I'd leave home about 6:30, both because there was so much going on or something to do, and because you couldn't get out of D.C. at 5 or 5:30 and go south on Shirley Highway or the Interstate 95, because you're bumper to bumper, and it'd take you, if you waited at the office an extra hour, you'd probably only be 10 minutes longer getting home if you just started. So often, and especially in the fall and the winter and the early spring, I went over what's called the Memorial Bridge. And if you've been in Washington, well, Memorial Bridge, as you're going into Virginia, you look up at Arlington Cemetery. And at night, you see a little flickering light. And that's President Kennedy's grave. And that was my way home. And so for a number of years, every time I went home, I'd cross Virginia over into Virginia Memorial Bridge, and I'd see that little flickering light. And that was quite a reminder.
Did you ever talk to Clint Hill about his experiences that day?
Clint Hill's a very good friend of mine, and we talk, but we don't talk about that. He did a tremendous job. I don't know how he made it. I don't know how he made it up onto the car in the first place, but in the second place, especially when he slipped and almost fell down. But the most important thing, how he stayed on that car when we were going 60 and 70 miles an hour down the Stebbins Freeway and about as fast as we could off and then over into Parkland Hospital. It's mind-boggling how he held on.
The Dallas Police Department came under a great deal of criticism after the assassination, especially for allowing Jack Ruby to get into the basement and assassinate Oswald. Do you think that, just based on your observations and your advance work, do you think that a lot of that criticism was justified at the Dallas Police?
There are police buffs all over, all the time. And that'll always be that way. If policemen, policewomen know all kinds of people in town, and they don't know what's in their thoughts. And I know that in many cases, they'll let an acquaintance come on in where they're not supposed to go, and 99 times out of 100 it won't matter. Like I said, originally there was just such a mess, on the afternoon of the 22nd in police headquarters. That's because they had other things going on, and there were just so many people flooding in there with things that they had going on. They just had an officer shot, they had that on their mind. The President of the United States had just been killed and all that. And so it just all added to the thing where there was chaos. And it probably was still chaos a couple of days later when Oswald was shot. And as I understand it, he was known to many, many people, not only in the city, around the city, both civilians and police and all that. They never gave it a thought.
You testified to the Warren Commission for a lengthy period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall any details?
No, I really don't.
Okay.
Other than the fact that I remember it was afternoon and I was there for a number of hours. But treated very well, I recall, but I have no idea even, other than I probably said roughly the same things that I'm saying here and that I've said other times later.
You mentioned before we started recording that for a number of years you couldn't talk about this subject.
That's right.
Can you talk about why that was?
Well, I'd get quite emotional. I really would. Thinking about, again, was there anything I could have done that I didn't do? the what ifs that we all know about. I just thinking, you know, how much the world changed because of that one thing that I was a part of, and the fact that you know, I was the first agent that got a president killed, and to this day I am. So I'd get quite emotional about it. But I gave my first interview around the 25th of anniversary of the thing, and I still get somewhat emotional about it, but especially when I talk about the Secret Service and how they treated me. And there have been times in the past, I don't think I did it today, but when I talk about the agents that come up to me and say, if it had to happen, we're glad it was you. There have been times when I've had tears streaming down my eyes talking to you about that. But I'm a little emotional right now talking about it, but not the extent that I was before.
Well, it's been 40 years this year since the assassination took place. You're back here in Dallas. Are there any particular thoughts or feelings being back here in this spot 40 years later?
No, our former Agents Association we have an annual convention every year someplace. Last week it was in Chicago and I was there. I've been an officer of one kind or another, either president, vice president, president-elect, past president, or board member for 20 years, and I just gave it up. Will be just a regular member now, like a lot of them, this past year. And well, I stopped being a board member last week. I didn't run for re-election, but well, got off on a tangent, I'm sorry.
We're talking about it being 40 years and being back here in Dallas.
Yeah, right, okay. Well, and I can't remember how long ago it was, but it was before your museum was made. We had one of our annual conferences in Dallas, and I had not been here in Dallas as part, while I was still in the Secret Service from 63 to 71. No plan of it. It just happened that whatever protectee I was with, whether it was a vice president or president, never happened to come to Dallas. And so I hadn't been there then. And I came to Dallas, and I'm going to guess it was maybe, I don't know, probably 87, 88, something like that we had a conference in Dallas. We've since had one, you know, we had one in Fort Worth and never had one in Houston, but you weren't open then anyway. I don't know. When was
we opened in February of 89.
89? Well, it was prior to that that I was here. And I remember that they had buses for us to come down to Dealey Plaza. And that was the first time. By that time I'd been retired for 6 or 7 years, whatever it was. We came down to Dealey Plaza, and I looked at Dealey Plaza, and and then went back, and we had our other functions for 2 or 3 days, and so forth. Then I was here in October of last year, and that's where the first time that I came to in here, and I met Mr. Mack, and he gave us a special tour. And then this time, so this is the third time I've been back since 1963.
Can I ask what you think of the idea of having a museum here at the site in this building?
Well, if you're going to have a museum, you can't have it in a more apropos place than where it happened.
If you would just start with the presidential party arriving at Love Field and take me through the motorcade.
Okay. To jump back a couple of minutes, the vice president's plane was in, and so that's the small staff of his, plus his agents and the vice president and so forth. They greeted the local host committee and some other people, and then went over to be in the area where we were going to spot the president's plane. The press plane had come in prior to that, because the press plane, at least in those days, and I would imagine still, the press plane tries to leave after the president leaves someplace so that they're able to see. It's like a death watch, frankly. They're waiting to see if something happens getting on the plane or before he gets on the plane, if the plane crashes or whatever. So then the president's plane takes off, the press plane gets up in the air, and if it's a far enough trip, then they somehow try to get ahead of the president, and then they land first so that they're in their press pen and so forth and doing their thing when the president arrives. Again, like the death watch or something, see whatever might happen. So you've got the press, and you got the local host committee, and you got the presidential car follows that lead car, and he stays up pretty darn close to the lead car to keep anybody from coming in between the two cars, just like the follow-up car is almost on their bumper, to prevent people, things, cars, etc. from coming out of a side street and being able to get in between. As a matter of fact, that's the only reason why Clint Hill was able to get on that car, was because it was so close to the president's car and all that.
In some of the films that we have here at the museum that show the motorcade going along, you see the buildings downtown, and there's open windows and people looking out of the windows. Yeah. Was that something that concerned you as you were going along? It concerned
you, but in those days there was nothing you could do about it.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a parade situation today, each field office has already made a survey of known motorcade routes, whether it's in Dallas or New York or wherever, to probably the areas that people would be going to in a motorcade type situation. Agents have inspected the building with the maintenance people, the building manager, owner, whatever. And today, the president's group visiting the president, and the president comes, and Mrs. Kennedy and some staff and agents and whatever come down, and goes over to the chain link fence that was there. I have pictures of it that there are all kinds of people on the other side of the fence, and there are all kinds of people on the airplane side of the fence. You can't even see the fence. There are almost as many people on the airplane side of the fence because of the hangers-on and the staff and the press and the this and that, So, and President Kennedy and Ms. Kennedy go along the fence greeting people and being seen and seeing people, and for a few minutes, and then they go over and get in their car, and the motorcade takes off. A special cut was made in the fence to allow the motorcade to go out to a certain place, to start the motorcade and all that. And the pilot car is now gone ahead, and the lead car that I was in was just ahead of the president's vehicle, a follow-up car behind him, and then some other vehicles, and the vice president and the staff, and it was quite a motorcade. Buses and staff cars and VIP cars and things of that type.
Who was in the lead car with you?
The lead car was driven by Chief Curry in his, either his or another unmarked Dallas police car, driving, so he was in the front seat. I was in the right front seat. Sheriff Decker was in the rear seat, and SAIC Sorrells, the agent in charge, Sorrells from the Dallas field office, was in the back seat. Unprecedented.
About how far ahead of the limousine did the lead car stay throughout most of the motorcade?
You usually try to be pretty darn close, so that they can see where you're going and all that, because if you have to go to a hospital, or you got to do this or that or whatever, in those days, especially when the driver didn't come, now probably one of the drivers would have been part of the advance team. I remember, I think I said before that you'd have site agents, depending on how many sites. You'd have a motorcade agent, you'd have the technical people, the intelligence people, the an airport agent, the site at the trademark agent, and so forth. But the lead car, these modern buildings, most of them, you can't open up a window. You know, these new high-rise office buildings and all that, the windows don't open. You can't even throw a chair through one if you wanted to. There are some of the older buildings and so forth that you still can open windows. But what they do, they put out a notice. I mean, this is not a country where by fiat you can just say you can't open your windows. I mean, it's not a totalitarian country, but you can request people not to open their windows. You can request people not to bring all their friends down and be in your window because, boy, this would be a great vantage point to see this motorcade. You know, please don't do that. If you want to see, go on down and whatever. Or if you are in your windows, they got to be closed or whatever. And they have enough people now with stationed along with radios and counter sniper teams on certain buildings that look down on other buildings and all that belong to the Secret Service counter sniper teams. And if they see an open window or if they see something that looks suspicious, and also it's requested that people not be on rooftops and all that. And there are certain things that they do so that you'd know if there's someone on that rooftop,